give me one shot here on a blue chip stock, believe me, Kevin, the only problem you're gonna have is that you didn't buy more.
Nobody knows if the stock is going to go up, down, sideways, or in circles.
What's going on, NBA draft fans? Your boys are back. The Wolves of Ball Street, your favorite draft analyst. It's your boys from the NBA Draft Show on the No Ceilings NBA podcast feed. My name is Corey Tulliba, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Albert Garbage Time Gim. Albert, what is going on, man?
Everything is going on, Corey. Life is going on. Basketball's happening. We're coming off the heels of the Super Bowl, so a lot of exciting stuff. But today's a really special, meaningful day for me, Corey. We've done this pod how long now? Like 3+ years, right? Like even pre No Ceilings, we've been doing this pod now, and we've had a countless number of guests and players and NBA guys join us. And this is the first time we're having someone on the pod who actually looks kind of like me. So this is super meaningful to me, but just want to take the opportunity to welcome in Coach Marshall Cho. Coach, just if you can give us a little intro about, who you are and what you're up to, what you're working on, and kind of a little bit of your story for our listeners out there.
Thanks, fellas. That was a phenomenal intro. You've done this. You've gotten your reps in it. So I'm honored to be hopping on with you professionals. I'm a high school coach by nature, by profession. Just finished my 8th year at Lake Oswego. And when I say just, I actually resigned from my position in mid-April following last year's Hoop Summit, shortly after the Hoop Summit. So it's been about 10 months of just kind of my pivot year, trying to figure out what I want to do next. Prior to Lake Oswego High School, I coached at University of Portland for a couple of years. I thought maybe the D1 basketball scene would be the route for me professionally. Ended up not being so, decided to, hop back into the high school world to prioritize my family, being around my kids, being around, my parents who are nearby, and, my mom is now entering her 10th year of fighting stage 4 breast cancer. So that's pretty humbling, but also just a reminder that, I've been fortunate to kind of prioritize family at this point. But prior to University of Portland and Lake Oswego, the 10 years prior to that were spent at DeMatha Catholic, being an assistant coach for 3 years at a powerhouse program. I lived in Mozambique, Africa for 3 years, my first 3 years of marriage, and, was doing all sorts of basketball, like you can imagine, like coaching little children to grown-ups, semi-professional players, high school kid, starting a high school program. So got to wear a bunch of different hats in my short 3 years in Africa. And so, this is my 20th year officially of coaching at some level. Currently, I am the 8th grade Gold 1 coach at Lake Ridge Middle School, which is ironically the rival of Lake Oswego High School. So I'm back in the youth basketball scene, my full circle, being an 8th grade middle school coach, dealing with, club coaches who are running zone press the whole time, and, all the shenanigans you can imagine. But it's been a blast, and I'm looking forward to what's ahead.
I mean,
I want to cut in because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and you brought it up early. Now, working with the middle schools, what are your feeling on, in the youth basketball, especially that age group, running zones and presses and stuff like that?
Yeah, I just had this conversation with Coach Showalter, Don Showalter, who, is now, right, he works with coaches through the USA Basketball Youth system. He's also, has a heavy influence on our junior national team program. And, I was just having this conversation with him the other day. He was asking about how my year was going, and I was recapping what I've experienced so far. And one of the things that I see a lot is, we have a 10 tournament minimum. So there's a little bit of that Groundhog's Day, in terms of, oh, this is another weekend. We know we're going to get 4 games. Is this a tournament we're trying to win, or is this a tournament we're trying to get reps in? But all that to say, we got about a month left in the season, and I've had 34 games and 20 practices. So I bring up Coach Showalter because, and maybe this also just goes back to a bigger conversation about why the best players in the world, at least at the top of the pyramid that we're seeing, the Luka Doncic, the Jokic, right? Even Giannis to an extent, right? Even though he didn't get the kind of development that, the other players got in Europe prior to getting to the States. But, a lot of these games, what I found myself saying is the things that I should be preaching and reinforcing in practice, when I really take a seat back and listen to what's coming out of my mouth, I'm running practice during these games. The things that I'm telling them to do, hey, jump under the weak side, right? Box out, high hand close out. All these things that should be stressed in a practice setting as a high school coach, which, even for public high school coaches, I've had 2 practices to 1 game, right? In the state of Oregon, we have 24 games. If you make it all the way to the very final day of the season, that's 29 games. But in a given season in high school, we have about 65 to 70 practices. And that's if you're counting the game day shoot arounds, which a lot of programs don't do, but I did because I came from a college setting, right? So I was really trying to get that ratio of maybe 2 practices to 1 game, right? But then for my high school program that I think we ran very successfully, we're talking about the fall workouts. We're talking about breakfast club morning workouts. And so those ratios got to be something more reasonable, to resembling a European model of 4 practices to a game. Well, in a youth game, youth system, I'm lucky if I get in the gym 3 times a week, right? So there's 2 guaranteed practices. And if that's the case, there's many weeks when I practice for 2 and play 4 games. So I think that's the biggest thing. And then you see, don't get me started on the guys who are just sitting in zone defenses for 8th graders. I think by 8th grade, getting into high school basketball, you should have some balance. For me, I think I try to keep with the 80-20 rule. I'm going to even if it's going to cost my team a game, I'm going to stay in man about 80% of the time. But I'm also going to throw out some zone 20% of the time, so that even my own players know how to adjust from jumping from a man defense to zone defense. But also just to expose them to it, because I don't know what their high school coach is going to do once they get them for 4 years. So it's all about that exposure. But the development piece of it definitely takes a back seat when there are so many games, being force fed upon you every weekend.
What an answer. Corey, I hope that's the answer you're looking for.
Yeah, no, it's abundantly clear, because, New York, all the kids are playing AAU, and, it's to the point where, when you get to the high school team, even the basic principles of a man defense, so many of the kids struggle with, anything where they're not directly on the ball, right? And it takes time to really hammer that home and make kids feel comfortable. And, coach, if a lot of times you have one kid who doesn't understand, where they're supposed to be, the entire defense can break down, right? And all of a sudden guys are scrambling. So it's really difficult in that regard. And then, where we're coaching, a lot of the middle school coaches are not necessarily basketball people. They're people that, in the public school system, maybe a phys ed teacher who they need to fill a spot. And, it's a lot easier to just be like, all right, we're going to sit in a 2-3 all game.
Yep.
But I've always thought, it's hard to even run a successful zone if you don't understand man principles fully. I think the best zones are, people who are fundamentally sound, even in, a man. So,
yep.
I think it's the point you made about the inverse ratio of practices in overseas versus here is just so important, because we've emphasized this gameplay. And, I don't know if it seems like it's not a positive thing necessarily, to run those guys out, and
right,
injuries and, wear and tear, and it's hard.
Yeah, and to be fair to, like what you said, to the middle school teacher who doesn't have that resource, right? And I think that's where, if you're fortunate to be a part of a community where there is continuity, and there is a connection between your fourth through eighth grade youth team, which I've had the good fortune of having, and then having that feed up to our high school program, right? A lot of the suburbs, you can get that kind of setup. Having, I taught in middle school math in New York City for 6 years. So I lived in Central Harlem, 118th and Lenox, just 3 blocks up from the Kingdom. And so I got to see some, crazy summer, summer outdoor games, with teams coming from Dykeman and different pockets of the, city up into my backyard. So that was such an eye-opening experience. But I do remember I taught at a charter school in Harlem, and the kids that I had, the team the very first team that I coached 20 years ago, made up of 6th through 8th graders. And I tried to teach my, man-to-man concepts, and, we played very little zone. But at the end of it, New York City, the kids are going to all over the place. And they, there wasn't just one feeder program. They weren't just going to go to one high school just up the street. Like, they had options, right? So, I think that's where, if you are fortunate to have, most public schools where you have a high school coach that's really dedicated and involved and takes an interest in the development into their youth program, I think you're always going to have a leg up, right? Because now you can hold your, youth coaches a little bit more accountable. Not just that, but just offer the support that they need. But, given the other constraints, I think it's easy for us to sit on the ivory tower of youth basketball czars, and say, and stomp our feet and pound the tables and say, hey, how bad is it here? But clearly it's not a puzzle that's easily solved. So what, it begs a question, like, what are the major institutions, whether that's USA Basketball, whether that's the NBA, whether that's junior NBA by default, of the organization, whether it's, the NCAA even, like, who can, because we have so many experts across, right? But who will take that leadership role and say, hey, like, here's a resource, use it. And to that end, I think, the organizations that I just mentioned have done their best. But, we also live in a world where everybody's an expert. So you need, I think you need youth coaches that are also humble and coachable enough to say, hey, there's a resource that's out there. Actually, let me take a look at it and see if I can put it to use.
Yeah, dude. First off, Coach, Corey and I were both from New York. So to hear, you talk about Harlem, my mom had a business in Spanish Harlem for most of my childhood. I grew up on the Lower East Side. So to hear that is incredible. And I know Corey still lives in New York. I live in Los Angeles now. But, just this conversation, you guys are both coaches. I'm not a coach. Like you mentioned, Coach, I'm one of those people who pretends to be an expert without actually being an expert, but I'm trying to get there. But something that you brought up, Coach, your coaching history / experience is incredibly extensive. Like, if anyone of our listeners were to go on your website and to look at the description and your bio and what you've been through, what you've seen, who you've coached, where you've been, it's an incredible story, right? And just this conversation has me thinking, because for Corey and I, our main focus for No Ceilings, in terms of our written work, our podcast stuff, video, whatever, all of it is just, like college or overseas or something of that ilk to the NBA, right? But when we talk about development and growth, right, there's so many different stages to that. And you mentioned you're coaching your son's 8th grade team. You've coached high school, college, Division I, Nike Hoop Summit last year, incredible hoodie, sweater you're wearing right there. But Coach, from your experience and what you've seen, right, and you've even done this abroad, where do you feel like there's the biggest jump relative to like where, a player is going from one stage to another, whether that's junior high to high school to college, college to NBA? Because I feel like the easy answer will always be like, hey, like going to college to the NBA should be the hardest. But I mean, you've seen it all. So I kind of wanted to get some of your insight on that, and from your experience and what you've seen, where you feel like the biggest jump is, and maybe more specifically, why that is the case.
Yeah, I don't think I have that answer that reinvents the wheel. I do think, as you get to the top of the pyramid, like going from good to great, right? And going from great to whatever, the elite of the world, the Damian Lillards, the Giannis Antetokounmpos, the the Kobe Bryants, right? I think that jump is incredibly hard. But for the general public, I think if you really look at the statistics of how many high school kids play basketball, and then given that there's every year only 2 to 3% of that mass, plays collegiately, I think that's probably the biggest jump, I would say, that people, and again, that I think that's where, not to just keep bashing this current ecosystem, but a lot of, like, even from my 8th grade parents, they've become conditioned to watching weekend games. And so as I'm one hand like screaming into the air about, the practice to game ratios, like, I'm not convincing most parents who've been conditioned from their child's youth program from 4th to 8th grade and come to 8th grade and say, nope, all of a sudden we're going to play half the number of games. Like, oh, I would have a revolt on my hands. So I think some of it is like just how people have been conditioned. So you talk about these AAU programs, a lot of the parents have been conditioned to think that their son is the one who's going to be one of the 3% or 2 to 3% that plays collegiately. And so I think just the truthful, honest conversations are really hard to have, and I think what you guys do and write up on all these college prospects, whether the agents or the players themselves or the families, they read it or not, I mean, who's to say, right? Because a lot of these guys have gotten to where they are because of their utmost confidence in betting on themselves, right? And so who are you to tell them, right? And that's really, honestly, like, who are we to tell them? There's been plenty of second round picks and free agent signees who've gotten their first, and second contracts, right? And that we may not have ever guessed because we couldn't measure what was in their heart. But to answer your question along with the way, I really do think the jump from high school to college is so hard. I went to watch a Division III basketball game just up the street from me. Lewis and Clark was playing University of Puget Sound. And I saw 2 of the players that I had coached against at the high school level here locally, 2 very good high school programs. Jesuit High School, which you guys all know about. Mike Dunleavy played in it. Eric Spolstra is an alum. He played there. And I saw a player that at the high school level was a pretty good player, but he was playing under his legendary high school coach's system, Gene Potter, who won more state championships here in our state than anybody else. And he had a leash. And like, even for me, I would have never been able to tell that, like, watching this kid 2 years later had, really just could shoot it, was super skilled. And if he was just 4 inches taller, he might as well be Reed Shepherd, who I just watched on TV for the first time, was blown away. Right. And so it really, there was 2 things that reminded me that basketball in our country is, whether, as we're lamenting, current ecosystem the way it is, just because we're a country that celebrates the game and there's so much easy access to the game. I mean, there are so many good basketball players out there. And then you realize so much of it just, again, it comes to ovarian lottery, whether your mom had the genetic disposition to give birth to a son who is a +4 in his wingspan. And it's as simple as that, And so, yeah, I mean, we produce so many players that, it's going to work out at the end, I guess.
For sure. I mean, hearing that last part is exciting for me. My wife is expecting, and my wife has really long arms, and I'm also a +6 in terms of my wingspan. So,
you're a +6.
Yeah. So I'm 6'2", but my wingspan's about 6'8". So
that's
hopefully,
not normal.
Yeah, not normal, but hopefully that extends to our daughter and she becomes something incredible is what we're hoping for. But Coach, it's something that I wanted to get into, and this is obviously for our listeners and our fans out there. But obviously the youth sports world is incredible, but we talk a lot about NBA prospects here, and it's funny, really quickly, Coach, what you mentioned before about like these second round guys and stuff, and who are we to tell them? I remember I was reminded of a couple conversations we had last year with some prospects, right? We spoke to Jalen Clark from UCLA and Drew Peterson, USC, and just hearing how they talk too. Like, I remember Jalen Clark mentioning to us how in high school he was like a rock star, and he, had the ball in his hands and he was able to do so much. And then him getting to UCLA, it took him a couple of years to realize, like, okay, I'm not in high school anymore. There's a new role for me etched out that if I'm not accepting and I don't realize what this is, then I'll never get a shot to do anything. And to his credit, he embraced his role. He continued to grow in the skill set that the coaching staff there with Coach Cronin and the rest of the staff what they asked him to do, he embraced it. He grew in it. He improved the outside shooting, was an incredible defender, and they got taken in the second round, even with the Achilles injury, you know? So I think the point that you made is such a poignant point, because it's so easy. Sorry, not easy. It's the opposite. It's really difficult, I think, for these guys to come from their different contexts at whatever high school they're at, whether it's charter, public, prep, whatever, to then go into a D1 program and be told you're going to ride the pine for a year, or, you know, maybe you'll play a little bit, you'll play 5 minutes, you know, off air. We talked about guys like Justin Edwards and, you know, Gary Duval, and the different adjustments they've had in their freshman seasons. But with that being said, Coach, you had the incredible opportunity to be, you know, one of the coaches last season at the Nike Hoop Summit for the world team, worked with Coach Canales, and, you know, just seeing Coach Canales was like near and dear to my heart as a lifetime Knick fan, and seeing him there was really cool. And I know you got to have that great opportunity. So before we even get into like the nitty gritty of different players, wanted to kind of get, you know, your feedback on what that experience was like, coaching with Coach Canales, with the other coaches there, and then seeing these world players and how they were coming from different contexts. Like a guy that I spoke to a couple of times, got to do a pod with, like an Alex Tuhey, right, who's now playing for the Sydney Kings. And, you know, you had like Aiden Holloway there, and Gary Duval, like we mentioned, Mackenzie Mbaku, like all these different players. What was that experience like, coaching with those coaches, with those players, and just your overall experience there last season?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I'm biased, but I believe the Hoop Summit is the best postseason All-Star game there is, because it's the only one that truly matters, because they keep records. Not that the McDonald's game or the Jordan Brand Classic or these other ones didn't, but you know, now we've reached a point where even at the NBA level, like they're talking about, hey, in future All-Star games, can we have a US versus world setup? Right. And the Hoop Summit game has been going on forever, you know, for decades now. It was humbling for sure. And just a little bit of a background, you know, my first involvement with the Hoop Summit was back in 2012. So, and that was, you know, being a support staff member with the USA basketball team. So that what that meant is, you know, right now, the junior national team program has become such a machinery and an organization, and you know, they are U16, 17 teams haven't lost a game in international competition since its inception, right? But you know, back when I joined in 2012, there wasn't like a manager, right? It's support staff sounds cooler than like manager. Basically, I was a 33-year-old manager for the, you know, a bunch of 18-year-olds, 18-year-old All-Americans. We're talking Mitch McGarry, Gary Harris. We're talking, you know, James Robinson, who was a 4-year starter at Pitt, who was one of the players from DeMatha. Kevin Boyle, currently in Montfort, was a head coach. He was at St. Patrick's. And Mike Jones, who is now at University of Maryland, he was my boss at DeMatha Catholic. He was the assistant coach. So long story short, I'm from this way. My parents live here in Beaverton, Oregon. So it was a chance for me to come home and just volunteer and be around the team for a year. And then, as luck would have it, I end up joining the University of Portland coaching staff a year later. And so I had a chance to stay involved and help with what they call the practice squad, which has become a legend in a urban, or I don't know, urban legend, but you know, that for the draft nerds, you know, the Portland Generals is quite a underground, legendary squad that gets assembled every year. Well, you know, my first year, 2012, we didn't have one, so I'm out there trying to, you know, play dummy defense against, you know, Mitch McGarry and Shabazz. Who is it? Shabazz Muhammad? Is that the UCLA player?
Yeah.
Bishop Gorman. You know, so the game has come quite a ways since then, but all that history to tell you, last year was the first time I made a conscious decision to, you know, hop over to the world team, you know, and a lot of it, I think, you know, as I was contemplating the move out away from Lake Oswego as well, it was just trying to really get back into my roots of having started with the NBA folks back in 2006 when I volunteered at the Basketball Without Borders camp. You know, I had a chance to start really, you know, I say my coaching career started in Harlem, but it really took off when I was living in Africa. And a big part of that I owe to the Basketball Without Borders family. You know, I got to see Amadou Gallo and Masai Ujiri and you know, Brooks Mead, Kim Buhaney, all these people just uplifting all these African players, You know, it was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. Dikembe Mutombo, who was a fixture, obviously, in the basketball scene there, you know, had built a hospital in Congo. And it was really the first time I got to see where basketball can truly impact a life. And it's one thing for us living in America to see the impact of it, but a life-changing thing for some of these players from Senegal and Angola and, you know, Cote d'Ivoire and all the countries to, you know, a handful of them to have a chance to come to the States and gain a college education. And, you know, many of those players I still keep in touch with to this day. So all that long-winded to say that I really wanted to kind of get back to that roots. I've worked for Yao Ming for his foundation camps and just knew that the game is going global. And I wanted, you know, to have a platform where if I'm able to work with some of the best players, like you said, from the world, what more of an impact could I have in the off season when I'm overseas and running clinics and meeting with coaches and growing in the game and hopefully taking aspects of what's happening outside of the US and try to bring it back here and be a bridge builder of sorts. So yeah, long-winded. I did get to chance, you know, just Caleb, same thing. I think, you know, Caleb was born and raised here in Laredo. So it was a chance for him to honor his father who had immigrated from Mexico. For me, I'm an immigrant. I came when I was 10. And so I think that was a really neat experience in that before, you know, the head coach was Roy Rana, right? And he would come in from Canada. But I think it's an indication again of how advanced our country has become and how really we become a home for the best players in the world. And what happens now is the best players in the world are starting to come earlier and earlier. So they're coming to all the prep schools across the country at 16, 17, 18. So, you know, you're talking about some of the players who were on the roster who had been going to the prep schools in the States for quite a bit of time. And I believe the statistics for this year's roster, last year's roster, which had 13 players, which is unique. Normally we have 12, but 11 of the 13 had been playing in the prep schools in the States. So, you know, I'm not sure where the balance will tilt towards in future years, but it's an indication that a lot of the better players in the world are already here. They're being discovered earlier, and whether they're ending up in Europe under one of the, you know, the Barcelonas or the Real Madrids or those kinds of programs versus, you know, the NBA Academy obviously has a lot of players that they're tracking and helping, and the rest of them are ending up here, you know, one way or another in prep schools all across the country. So in terms of camaraderie and chemistry, I think it was quicker to establish than other years that we observed. But the biggest thing I take away from Coach Canales is he's just a consummate professional. If I have 20 years of experience in high school and youth basketball, he has 20 years in the NBA, you know? So it was awesome just to kind of see how the tempo and the pacing and how he kept, you know, he wasn't overcoaching, I would say. I think he understood the time of the year where a lot of guys were banged up, you know, they're tired, and the world team generally comes into town 3 days before the US. So on one hand, it's a huge advantage in terms of game preparation and whatnot, but in the hands of somebody not as experienced as Coach Canales, like you could burn out your players, you know, come game time. So just getting to see how he managed that, I think he managed it like he did, you know, in his professional stops, and he understood that less is more, but that less, you know, the tight, you know, window of time that we have for practice, there was no wasted time. You know, we got to work and we got out. So that was really, it was important for me to see as a high school coach. I think we tend to overcoach and overteach and talk a lot like I'm doing on your podcast right now. But I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. Like if I'm really in a practice setting, we had phenomenal assistant coaches, Akachi, who's with the Sacramento Kings before, and he was an assistant coach with Coach Canales and Coach Rana. He came and did all the video and worked on our defensive schemes. And, you know, we had Zach Gonzalez, who was a GA back in the day at University of Oregon, who's working on professional players. He came up and volunteered. So and even that part's really evolved. You know, we may not have like official coaches on roster, but we had so many volunteers and student managers who were rebounding. It really felt like an operation that, you know, I think going back to 2012 when I was the student manager, wiping the floor and being a practice player, it's become quite a production.
I think, you know, I was watching those practices so intently, and I was taking things back. And I was like, oh, I can, use this for my own team. And I think one of the interesting things you guys were doing is, you would be going over, skill work or whatever. And then you would throw in like 8-minute scrimmages in, not like at the end of a practice or whatever. It would be like, in different spurts.
Yes.
And that was really cool. And, I remember specifically you were going over some kind of skill thing, and Mackenzie and Baco like executed it in that next little scrimmage. And we were like, oh, wow. Like it really allowed for the players to take what they were working on in individual skill drills and then put it into practice immediately. So it's not something that it's almost like, because, high school kids, sometimes their attention span, it's hard to, sometimes like when you see some of these kids who are 6, 7, and, they look like they're 25 already physically, you forget that they're 17, 18 years old. And like, a lot of times it can go in one ear out the other for kids. But having those scrimmages in spurts throughout the practices really, I felt like allowed them to really hone in on the skills that you were working on in the practices. So I thought that was really cool. And it's something that, I took back with me back to New York.
Yeah, skills, definitely some skill component of it. The players just love that, right? They're one of the 13 selected for a reason. We didn't have any kid who was lazy about, getting those reps. So they thrived on that time, because it's me time, like it's time for them, right? But skills aside, it was also like being really intentional about the shots that they're getting, right? Because those are the shots that's going to translate, right? For Mackenzie, it was a lot of catch and shoots, but then, what do you do when you're being chased off the line, right? So it's a one dribble pull up, and I thought he was, when you saw him, it's, we did have the benefit that he got to play for back-to-back years, right? So you also see a young man who's kind of figuring it out and knowing the cadence and the rhythm of the week-long practices, and in that sense, it's a really cool experience for these kids to be treated like professionals.
Yeah. No, Coach, I remember, we were there last year, and Corey he was raving about the practices that you guys were running, because we got to see both, right? We got to see Team USA, we got to see the world. And, definitely everything that you're talking about, the energy, the professionalism. And I think that's such an important point, because if we're being honest with ourselves, Coach, when it comes to these types of exhibitions, and you said you had 13 players, the world had, however many, and these kids are there, and their goal in life is pretty singular, right? They want to get to the highest level possible. They want to play with the greatest players on planet Earth, and they want to be the absolute best. And I think along those lines, something that, I wrote in our outline that I sent to you earlier, and that it has me thinking a lot, because you guys are working with these youth students, right? Junior high, high school, whatever. We can't, like, as much as you guys want to get into the nitty gritty and coach them about, details and, like the micro stuff with them, I feel like all of them ultimately have the NBA in mind. And it's like that big gorilla in the room that you cannot ignore, right? It's the NBA. That's where they all want to get to. And something that, and I guess this is a question for both of you guys. And I love this, because even when we do our pods and we're doing player breakdowns, I like to throw in questions for Coach Corey to kind of, get on his soapbox and talk about. But what I want to ask both of you guys is, with that in mind, right, with the NBA always kind of being this like overarching thing and this goal that all the players are looking for, how much of an influence do you see that with your players, and how much of that is both beneficial and also difficult as you guys are trying to get these players to be the best possible players that they can be? How much of it, like the NBA, right, and the goal and the mission of getting there, how much does that benefit the players, but also at times, can it be an obstacle or like a stumbling block for them?
Gotcha.
Well, this is an easy answer for me, because I'm not, none of the kids that I coach really have the NBA in mind. For my kids, it would mostly be like, getting to a junior college, a D3 situation. And, I think that can, I don't know if they're so distracted by that as much, because, the end goal there is like, also, do they have the major that I need to you know, sign up for in order to like maybe get the job that I want when I'm older. So I think it's a little different than like working with, you know, the absolute top tier talent, not only in, you know, the high school classes and domestically, but, you know, we mentioned earlier, like Zachary Richeche is now the projected #1 pick on ESPN's board, and he was somebody who was, you know, on that world team, right? So like getting to work with that kind of pendulum is a little different from my job than, you know, what, you know, Coach, you were tasked with the Hoop Summit team.
Yeah, but you know, my day-to-day at Lake Oswego was not much different than yours, Corey. I think, you know, 8 years I produced maybe 2 Division I basketball players, a couple other D2s, and a handful of D3s. So, you know, I think kids are realistic in that sense, and those who are delusional, you don't need to beat them down, because the game, the truth fears no questions. The game will tell you if you're good enough or not. 2 things come to mind as you're asking that question. I think, you know, last year I had a really good basketball player, sophomore Winters Grady, who's now competing as a junior on Prolific Prep, right? So we're talking about, you know, again, with the NIL, you know, now being open, not just in collegiately, but in our state of Oregon, NIL is available to high school players as well. And so a lot of, you know, old school coaches are lamenting it. What is the world coming to? But the bottom line is, you know, for basketball, we're behind the times. Like, you have 15-year-old gymnasts getting NILs or, you know, professional contracts. So in that sense, what I've seen is truly a separation between those who want it or are pursuing it, right? Like, who am I to judge? You know, like Winters Grady, I saw him suiting up in the starting lineup against Montfort for the 2nd round of their matchup this year. I mean, he's on the floor with Cooper Flagg, Liam McNeely. He's got Zoom Diallo and AJ DeBonsa on his side, Tyrone Stokes, you know, and he's you know, getting a chance to compete at the highest level, right? So I think those who have that ambition, you know, and again, like, his measurements aren't, you know, +2, +4, whatever, right? He doesn't jump out the gym, so he has to lean on his skills, and, you know, elite skill is shooting. But, you know, there's so many of those players across the country, so that's a real challenging thing, right? And you know, when kids are choosing into that path where you're going to have to face adversity and failure on a regular basis, and then if you come on the other side of that hard, and you've given yourself a chance to compete for a roster spot, I mean, that's a miracle. You know, for any kid like playing in America, that is a miracle. Like, there's so few. And so I think anytime we come across those kids with that dream, you can't squash it. But at the same time, you have to tell them the reality of it, and you have to remind them. And the flip side of that is, you know, for our world team roster, for example, you know, the guys who are in the top 5 pre-draft, you know, list are the Riz and the Cody Williams. Well, both Cody and Zachary had a subpar showing at the Hoop Summit.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's a reminder, it's one game. Everybody calm down. You know, Alex Toohey didn't play that much, and he was just okay. And he didn't answer the question of, hey, is he athletic enough? Well, you know what? He's down in the NBL doing just fine, you know, and in his own time, because who he is, who his parents are, who his coaches were, if he has, you know, all the right foundations, it might not happen this year. It might not happen next year. Shoot, he might be a Joe Ingles, you know, late bloomer in the league, right? And so I think just that we live in such an impatient world. We want to judge right away. And again, I'll take this away from me. I'll steal this from Coach Canales all day, every day, because, you know, I grew up in the Hoop Summit game, so I revere it. There's a certain level of respect for it, the awe of it. Every time I do it, you know, that I'd have to take a step back and pinch myself that I get to be a part of this game. And I think that could be a trap for somebody like me, because I'm elevating the importance of this game more to these players more than maybe what it is. Coach Canales did this thing. We had a whiteboard, and he just drew a long line. I can't be on the screen. He drew a long line on the board, and he just was putting dashes alongside it. And it's like your timeline as a basketball player. And he just goes, see this? This is just one night. Like, it's a big game. It's an important game. It's a fun game, but it's one night. Like, this doesn't determine all the other basketball games you're going to have moving forward. You know, and even if you play bad, like, it's not going to determine if, you know, you're going to play in the league or EuroLeague or NBL or KBL or wherever. You know, if you're good, it's gonna work out. And I thought that was such a important message for these guys to hear. You know, and given that, like, there's so much pressure on these guys at 17, 18, 19 already. You know.
Yeah, and like you mentioned Cody Williams, like I think he played like 3 minutes.
Yeah,
in the actual game itself.
And his brother was upset.
His brother was, Jalen was upset. But you know, because, and especially when you are young, you do, I feel like moments like these, you know, sometimes when you're a kid, like a certain moment can impact you and feel like it's the biggest moment of your life or the end of the world, right? And, you know, for a game like this where you are working out, practicing for as long as you are, and, you know, to go through that, you know, it can really, you know, make you want to work harder to prove everybody wrong, or you can fold. And, you know, to somebody like Cody's credit, he got no shine in this game, then, you know, kind of struggled in the FIBA tournament. And now he's a projected, you know, top 3 to 5 pick, and he's the #1 prospect on some boards. So, you know, I think that timeline is something that's really important for these players, knowing that it is just a dash on that line. And it's important, and you can learn a lot, and, you know, you can make an impact. Obviously, you know, you look up and down in that building at the Blazers practice facility, and it's the who's who in, you know, the NBA, right? And that's a lot of pressure in and of itself. Because in a lot of ways, it's, you know, for the players, those practice settings are probably more important than the game itself, right? Because those are the decision makers who are seeing you up close. A lot of them probably for like the first time. But yeah, it's just a dash at the end of the day in a very long road of the process. And, you know, with what we do, taking a 1-game sample of anything and making a definitive conclusion from it is, you know, irresponsible for, you know, for what we do. So yeah, it's a complicated process, but yeah, sometimes you do have to kind of, like you did, move back a little bit and take the you know, big view on it.
Right. Yeah. And Corey, you know, to your point, you know, we mentioned Risa Shea, we mentioned Cody Williams, and they didn't play too well, and they're having great seasons right now. On the opposite end, we had guys that were a little bit more like prolific during that game, and then now in their freshman seasons, it's not going exactly how they probably planned and were hoping. Like, you know, just to name some guys, like Justin Edwards, as we've mentioned, Corey, he was like #1 on our preseason big board. He's having a tough freshman season, right? Guys like Isaiah Collier hasn't been perfect this year. The list goes on and on of these guys. DJ Wagner, another name, right? And it's interesting. Even for them, now the narrative is shifting, and we're seeing their names drop or plummet even down certain big boards and mock drafts and whatever. Another guy, Ron Holland, right, is another name. And, you know, he played really, really well during that game and was hustling and doing all kinds of stuff. And yet, you know, this season for him at the G League Ignite has been a bit of a roller coaster, right? Some highs and some real lows for him. And I think even for these guys, as Corey, you and I are draft evaluators, right? And we're trying to project these guys and what they'll look like on the next level. We also, and this is something that I have to remind myself of all the time, is on the other end of the spectrum for guys like I just listed, just because they have a terrible freshman season or a not so successful freshman season doesn't mean that their basketball careers are over. Doesn't mean that, you know, suddenly, you know, we're projecting them as #1 options, and now we're projecting them to be like the last guy on the bench of the NBA one day, or to never make the NBA. And I think like that type of bird's eye view, or like a macro type of vision for these kids, is a really important aspect of what we do as well. And so with that in mind, Coach, we're really looking forward to the 2024 Nike Hoop Summit for good reason, right? There are some incredibly exciting names at the top of both rosters, I think, or at least for the US roster is kind of like where our focus is. And actually, Coach, I think this was back in Christmas, around Christmas time, you did an IG Live and you were at a restaurant with some friends, and you guys were talking a little bit about Cooper Flag and
Oh my
different
goodness.
names.
Right.
And so, Coach, my question for you, and this is a really exciting one for us because we're making plans right now to be there for the 2024 Hoop Summit. Hopefully, we can see you out there. Maybe we can go get some food or something. But wanted to ask you about this upcoming class because the names are incredible, right? Obviously, the headliner there is going to be Cooper Flag, but wanted to get some of your insight on this class, maybe how it stacks up to some of the other classes you've seen, and maybe some names that maybe aren't like the high names, but maybe we have to continue to keep on the radar for us as well.
I'm sure you're putting me on the spot because now it's been a little while since I've worked with this class, right?
Yeah.
Cooper, obviously, the last mini camp I got to do was October 2 years ago. So the irony of that is, I got to work with Aiden Holloway, and so that was my last involvement with the U.S. Junior National Team. And we had Aiden Holloway and Omaha Billiu, right? Is that how you say his last name? Omaha, since his sophomore year, I believe. Omaha played for the world team and actually flipped over to the U.S. team for the Hoop Summit game. And Aiden had been at the USA mini camp, and we were kind of laughing about it that both of us had been at the US camp, and we were both suiting up for the world team in the next game. So yeah, I think just a few of those guys like Cooper I've known since his freshman year.
Wow.
So to be honest with you, I'm not super familiar with this roster. If anything, I'm probably a little bit more familiar with the world team roster because I've been paying attention to it more.
For sure.
But we know that they're going to be coached by Sharman White, which I turned 48 this year, and I'm a dragon. So that means I'm a dragon. So this is, I've been saying, this is a big year for me professionally, and it's the year of the dragon. It's really the year of the Sharman White. He's going to coach in the McDonald's game. He'll be the U17 head coach, going for gold again, and coaching in the Hoop Summit games. So, and he's got Frank Bennett and Nick Logaba, who were assistants last year, coming back to assist, I think. So let me just start there, since I'm buying time basically as I was pulling up the roster.
Industry secret there.
And like that coaching is so much of it. And I think that's where Coach Rana, who did it for 10 years, had such an advantage, because it was like clockwork. You had to get into the rhythm of it. And, to me, I mean, Coach Steve Turner, first time Hoop Summit coach last year, did a phenomenal job. I can only imagine, normally there's 12 on the roster, there's 13, just all the adjustments that he must have had to make, in a short amount of window. For both Coach Bennett and Logabo, that was their first assignment, for the Hoop Summit game. So, we definitely when we were prepping on the world side, thought we had a chance to, steal that game, even though the roster maybe wasn't as, balanced as in previous years. But, they got, USA Basketball got the W, and now we're, reloading with two assistant coach who have the experience, coming back. You got Sharman White, who's coached the junior national team, and he was around for the weekend as well, to just kind of take in, because that's a huge adjustment. No matter what you've done professionally as a high school coach, you look out into the Trailblazers facility and you see every single GM. You just kind of, if that's your first time, it takes a certain level of focus and the ability to just block out all that noise. It's an adjustment. But yeah, just looking over, I know Asa Newell a little bit, Jaden, Ian Jackson from your neck of the woods, New York City.
Yeah.
Those are the players I'm familiar with.
Actually
David
born
Castillo.
in my town.
Is he now?
Yeah. Out on Long Island. Yeah.
That's amazing. His cousin, I taught at a charter school in Harlem.
Wow.
Which is wild, but
incredible.
Small world. But yeah, I think it's typical USA Basketball roster. They can full court press. They can get after it. The guard play is going to be really elite. And then you get the Ace Baileys and the Cooper Flags, who are just, like lockdown lottery picks. So, I think a lot of it will come down to the matchup. A lot of it will come down to guard play. Over the years, I mentioned Aiden Holloway. When I saw him on the world team roster, I thought he was going to have a big game. I just seen historically over the years, guys who can really shoot it, and are playmakers, can handle being in that big NBA court with the 24-second shot clock. I think those guys have really stood out over the years. I'm talking Darius Garland, when I was helping with USA basketball on the other side, was like somebody who came off the bench, unassuming looking, not much different than Aiden. Hit huge 3-pointers to keep USA in the game. I'm thinking back to like Terrence Ferguson, if you guys remember him, T Ferg.
Yep.
Set the game record. I think he had like 7 threes. I'm making that up, 5 to 7 threes. And so I think the shooting is at a premium. All the best players are out there. But if you're open and you can knock them down, I think that's a huge, difference maker. And then, it just comes down to, Tyus Jones was steady as ever. I still have nightmares about who's our German point guard. Why am I blanking on his name? The devilish. What is his name?
German point guard.
Played for the Lakers, turned down his contract. Just played with
Dennis
the
Schroeder.
Raptors. Schroeder.
Yeah.
I mean, Schroeder was, when they say Dennis the Menace, I mean, I saw that firsthand when he was giving our U.S. guards the business. Like, he couldn't be pressured, right? So Dennis Schroeder, is somebody that comes to mind. So,
Coach, were you around for Jokic?
I was, yeah. I mean, I think, if I'm trying to remember, was Jokic and Towns in the same team? Was that the same year?
I think so.
Yeah,
I'm
I remember
sure,
just.
yeah.
I mean, the world team has traditionally had so many bigs, and all the big bodies just blur after a while. Just the Eastern European bigs, it's just another face in the crowd, like everybody said, and especially because Cat was on the team as well, I think.
Right.
So and Don Maker, am I crazy? Was Don Maker on that team? Was that the same year?
I could check.
You can double check. I just, that it all blurs at this point, but
yeah.
No, Corey, if you're asking me if I remember Jokic, no, I do not.
It's funny how that works out.
Right? Dash, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's fun. I'm actually going to go see Cooper this weekend. He's playing at Hofstra against Lehigh, which will be
that's a big one.
Yeah, it'll be a big game. And it's funny. I saw Montford last year, and like even with those big prep schools, like you look at a guy like Cooper who's been projected, top 2 guy for years now, and he was coming off the bench and playing behind Sean Stewart and all the guys because Montfort, those teams, those prep schools, they're all loaded with guys that are going to Duke and wherever else, right? And it's funny seeing a guy like Cooper almost like have to wait his turn, right? As the underclassman playing behind the guys. He really didn't even play that many minutes in the game that I saw him in. So, but I'm going to enjoy getting to watch that context of seeing him, in that context, coming off the bench as, a sophomore, I guess he was last year. And then, now this year kind of being beached, and then following that, getting to see him, in practice settings at the Hoop Summit and in that context, and I'm looking forward to that because he's obviously a really talented dude, and he's going to be playing with a bunch of other talented guys. And I always like seeing how those guys mesh with all of that talent. And maybe, for the Montverde guys and those big prep schools where every single player can really hoop, maybe it's a little easy to mesh together with other top talent, but it's an interesting recipe throwing a bunch of guys together who really have not played much together. Right. And now they're, for the first time, even with a week, or, even if they'd played in the McDonald's game and, it's tough. It's a tough situation to see how they handle it. And I'd imagine, especially for maybe the world team too, because now you're throwing potentially like different language barriers in potentially. Right. And like being around that, is that something that you found challenging at all? Like I don't know how much English Zachary Richet speaks,
he was fluent. He had no issues.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was great. And again, like I told you that this last year, I think was an anomaly in that 11 out of 13.
Yeah.
Right? But, I think that's the way the world is going now. So, you know, it would be fun to have a player from, you know, a Spanish-speaking country who doesn't speak and, you know, trying to figure it out. And, you know, when he does eventually make it, just, you know, be able to tease him about it, you know, 5, 6 years later, if he's carved out a career in the league. But no, we didn't run across that issue last year. Zach cracked jokes, you know, so it was good.
Coach, I just pulled up the 2014 Hoop Summit. Looks like we had Karl Anthony Towns was there, Nikola Jokic, Clint Capella was a name.
That's
on the U.S. side, there was like Miles Turner, Jahlil Okafor, Justice Winslow, pretty good class, you know. Emmanuel Mudiay.
The U.S. won that game, correct?
Yeah.
I remember because I think my Coach Jones was involved. I can't remember who were the coaches for the U.S. team that year.
Give me one second.
Does it say
the sheet that I'm looking at?
I only remember because I went and got Voodoo Donuts. That was my task, one of my many tasks of the week on the support staff. So I was handing out victory donuts post game. So yeah.
How early do you have to get there to make the scheduling work?
Well, you know, actually, I think I delegated, which a good operations guy will always do. So I had a friend of mine pick him up, and then I got him to the locker room. So that was a W. Yeah.
Pop quiz for both of you guys. Who do you think was the leading scorer in the 2014 Nike Hoop Summit? If you had to guess.
Oh, Mudiay.
There it is. Emmanuel Mudiay had 20 points in that game.
Yeah, he was really good in high school.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. Unfortunately, things didn't exactly pan out for him in the NBA, but
he had his moments though.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. He did
with the Knicks.
You know, with the Knicks, Coach Visdale saying, you know, mud will get you right, is what he said in his opening press conference. But Coach, did want to say, I know we're kind of, you know, getting tight on time now, but before we close, something that, and this is something that I picked up from Bill Simmons this season, you know, before Doc Rivers went and got hired by the Milwaukee Bucks, he'd have Doc Rivers on his pod every other week. And something that he would always close the pod with, he'd be like, Coach, Doc, you know, give me a story, man. Like, you've coached in the NBA so long, you've met, you know, you've coached incredible players, Hall of Famers, blah, blah, blah. Coach, I'd like to say that you've coached a lot of people, a lot of players all over the globe. Just if you can give us, whether it's, you know, across the globe or even at Lake Oswego would be a great, you know, place to maybe pull a story from. If you could just share a story with us about either like an interesting player or an interesting game, either someone you coached or coached against, something for us before we wrap things up.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. Yeah, that's a tough one. I again, locally, people have heard me tell this story many times, but you know, my rude awakening into the high school scene in Oregon was my first year at Lake Oswego was the 2015-16 season, which coincided with Peyton Pritchard's senior year at Westland from the mean streets just across the corner here from Lake Oswego. We're next door neighbors, rivalry game. And they were the #1 ranked team that year, super balanced. They had a big Brooks DeBishop, who ended up being a Division I basketball player in Northern Arizona. They had, you know, a few others, you know, Jaden Grant, Brian Grant's son, who ended up being, you know, converting to a college cornerback and now is playing for the Raiders. So just like an embarrassment of riches. And then there's Peyton, who's just one of the biggest dogs I've ever known. Talk about adversity. I saw him get cut from the U16-17 tryouts, you know, even though he performed well, but again, he was undersized. He's not somebody who was going to be able to, you know, pressure these overseas FIBA guards with the 24-second shot clock. And, you know, and so anyhow, I've seen him go through his ups and downs. Unfortunately for me, his career high in high school basketball at 45 points came against me on our Lake Oswego floor. So I always hang on to that just as a little piece of humble pie that, you know, ultimately it just comes down to the players who can make the plays. I thought I schemed really well and prepped really well. If I'm patting myself on the back, had him with 3 fouls and, you know, like 8 points at halftime, bottled him up. Maybe we're only down 5 and we have no business being down 5. And thought for a split second that we had a chance at stealing this game. And Peyton comes out around the locker room, and our gym setup at Lake Oswego is the visiting team has to walk across the home bench because the locker room is in the same hallway. And my 3 assistant coaches saw the look on Peyton's face as I was sitting on the bench, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "He got that look, coach. I don't know." and sure enough, a 35-point, 37-point barrage of threes and ISOs later, yeah, he had his career high. And I think at around the 40th point, he made some ridiculous shot, and I just laughed out loud. I was like, come on, man. This is just abuse. And, you know, it was pretty traumatizing for my point guards who I left on an island. So my players and I, we can all laugh about it all these years later, which is, again, a reminder that this is a game. Yeah, and it should be enjoyed as such.
We're gonna have to go and check out Synergy to see if that game is
it's out there.
Available to watch.
Sure, it's out there. I will send you a huddle download if you would like. Yeah, welcome
absolutely.
to it.
Yeah. No, right before we close, just because Corey and I, we were big fans of Peyton Pritchard when he was, entering the draft. We were both like, we don't care that he's older. We don't care that he spent a couple of years at Oregon. We're watching his tape and we're like, this guy's an absolute dog. He's an absolute shot maker, a guy who is, willpower over talent all day long. Like, we would sign up to have this guy on our roster every day of the week. Before we can close, if you could just give us a really quick scouting report just from like what you saw back then. Like, who was Peyton Pritchard as a player, strengths, weaknesses, whatever? How were you game planning for him?
I mean, it's funny because just let me dig deeper, guys. I mean, thanks. It was my fault just even bringing this up, so I blame myself. I've lost track of how many times that people, I'm like, call the West Lynn coaches and ask them. The lore of Peyton in our neck of the woods is insane because it's not just it's everybody can do. Like, if you put him and put a scouting tape next to Reed Shepherd, I would imagine it's very similar, right? Similar comp, size, shooting skills, pedigree, right? Like his parents didn't play basketball, but his dad was a football player and his mom was a gymnast at Oklahoma. So some of that, like the athlete gene and just the work ethic that comes with it, he was kind of born into. I think the thing that stands out to me more than anything is how he represented his community and really took care of like the kids coming up behind. And so currently there's, the next guy who had to carry the torch and have that burden is Jackson Shelstad. And he's a freshman at University of Oregon, having a very successful year. But this is, again, like, credit to Peyton, same thing. I mean, now you're just making me torment myself all over again. But, Jackson's sophomore year during our COVID season, we were playing our basketball games in June. We were the last state in the continental United States to be playing games, high school games, for seniors who had already graduated, essentially. And so we're playing West Lynn, same thing. I think I'm a good enough coach that if I'm going to make my opposing coach at least make a halftime adjustment, right? And so we're bottled up Jackson. We're within striking range. And Jackson comes out gangbusters. And I wouldn't say 35. He must have had like 25. And they win the game going away. And I'm leaving the building, and there's Peyton Pritchard walking out with me. He's like, hey, we exchanged pleasantries. And then he has to just kind of, he didn't do this intentionally, but he's like, yeah, coach, I really had to like go into the locker room and really lit into Jackson, tell him to wake up. And, and I'm like, come on, man, like, just leave me alone, at this point. Like, it's one thing to like cost me a game when you're playing, but to go and challenge the next guy up. But I think that speaks to who he is. He really cares about, the legacy and his little brothers. And I think that's what just makes him really special. I think any community that can have him is lucky to have him. The Celtics got him now. Maybe we'll get the Blazers will, get a sniff at him down the line. Who knows? But,
sounds like you needed Kevin Love to come into your locker room and light your guys up.
Light my guys up. Yeah, I take that. But no, not to be.
Okay. Coach, we really, really this has been incredible. I mean, conversations of youth sports to the Hoop Summit to Peyton Pritchard just tormenting you has been incredible. And you know, Coach, I think for us, you know, this is, as you mentioned, we're like NBA draft nerds, and
Yeah.
these types of conversations, because like for Corey and I, you know, week after week, we're talking about player X and what they can do, things that they need to work on. But I mean, these types of conversations are also so valuable as well, because this is a side that I think a lot of times, whether it's the media and how they portray basketball and the youth system and players and whatever, or it's even people like us that just focus kind of like off of what we see off tape, whatever. I think this type of context, contextual explanation of what all this is so important as well. And I think this has been such a valuable conversation for us to kind of see your side on the coaching side, and also your wealth of experience everywhere. And so just really appreciate you joining us and giving us your time, because it's been awesome for us. And before we go, Coach, if you can kind of give us, you know, anything you're working on, anything that's, you know, in the lab, what's next for you, that type of stuff before we close out.
Yeah, there's too many. I think the range, you know, this year's been a lot about feeding my starving my distractions, feeding my focus. So I think a lot of that has to do with working with coaches and helping coaches, you know, succeed, share a little bit of the secret sauce of what we were able to do at Lake Oswego in a short period of time. So anybody who's interested, if you're a coach, you know, you're struggling or having a hard time, or, you know, want to think about how to be a community builder, you know, any of the coaches out there are always welcome to reach out. I have a website, just my full name, marshallcho.com. I've been offering up a lot of clinics and camps and things of that nature, but also just working on a few projects where I'd like to have a bigger impact in Asia. You know, I'd like to help the players there. I'd like to work with the coaches there. I think the city of Portland, you know, we've taken a lot of beating over the COVID period, you know, just maybe some negative press about, you know, the state of our downtown. But I think that's just the case across the country. But Portland as a whole, I think, is a super underrated basketball city. We have an NBA franchise. We have Nike right in our backyard. You know, we have the Adidas World headquarters, U.S. headquarters is also here. Under Armour. We have Whiten and Kennedy, you know, a marketing agency that's done so much, you know, so much influential work in the sports industry. And then all the colleges at the D1, D2, D3 levels. So I think I would love to be a part of like helping Portland come up and see if this is a place where we can bring coaches and players. And again, the fact that we have the best post, you know, high school season all-star game is a good starting point. So, you know, I already have a handful of friends, coaching friends, who are flying in to observe and learn. But, you know, beyond that, I think the Hoop Summit is just a reminder of how special the city is in terms of basketball. So hopefully I got some future projects down the line that will, you know, I'll be able to highlight and showcase.
Got it.
Awesome.
That sounds great.
Well, whenever you have those to showcase, if you want to talk to them and you want a platform, you're always invited back on ours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys.